being here, Carl. Okay. Good afternoon. We have a follow-up session from Juan Antonio's presentation about IBM, focusing on big data. I hope that you can stay awake. We have three, unfortunately, Juan had to leave, but we still have three quite provocative and scary discussants, a member of the panel. I've asked him to answer very briefly within 10 minutes so that we can leave lots of question and answers. Three basic questions, I think. One is, do you think that this thing called big data is real? And following up on the previous presentation. And if yes or no, what does it really mean for us, especially in the tourism and hospitality area? And the third is, of course, what's the future? They have to answer this in 10 minutes. If they don't, I grab them and tear them off the stage. But actually, we have three really quite distinguished speakers. Of course, you've seen Kelly this morning in the keynote speech. We also have David. Each one of them will introduce themselves in terms of who they are and what their background. And then last but not least is JP. So thank you very much for joining us. This would be an informal, semi-crazy discussion, but hopefully we can learn a little bit. And within the context of the earlier presentation, I hope that we can push it forward and put some interpretation on what was shown, the vision that IBM certainly has for big data, and what it really means for us in the industry. So Kelly will go first, and so on. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone. It's good to see you all again and to be back with you. How is my volume? Am I okay? No, we're good. Okay. So I spent a lot of time talking about, thinking about, worrying about, trying to understand big data in my role at SAS. So we are the largest privately held software company in the world, specializing in analytics. And if you want to be an analytics company, you have to be a data company. And so we spend a lot of time at SAS trying to design our solutions to meet this ever-growing big data phenomenon. Now, whenever I approach this topic, I usually start with a definition. Why is big data such a big deal? What is it? And why are people worried about it? Because this term is almost as bad as the term optimization in terms of becoming a buzzword for industry that just gets used over and over again, and I think maybe without as much understanding as there could be. So the Gartner definition of big data, which was alluded to this morning in this presentation, is the phenomenon whereby the volume, variety, and velocity of data exceeds an organization's ability to process and derive insights at the speed of business. So if you think about it, particularly in the hospitality, travel, and tourism industry, we do have a lot of data. Especially the larger the company gets, your sort of transactional data could grow. But the real thing that is challenging us is actually the second two V's in that article. So when I speak to hoteliers, they may say to me, well, Kelly, I'm not sitting on petabytes of data like Amazon. I'm not Google. I don't have this huge, massive data set. But really, in today's environment in hospitality and travel, we've got a lot more different types of data than we've ever dealt with in the past. So from what I talked about this morning, the unstructured text data from reviews, there's location data from mobile devices that we also addressed this morning. There's ratings, there's clickstream data from web traffic. And our technology infrastructure is not set up to easily integrate all of these sources of data so that we can even start to derive insight from them. And then add on top of this the fact that a tweet or a location is stale the minute it happens, right? We've got a velocity problem as well. And so yes, this phenomenon of big data is real. It's requiring a lot of thought in how how we manage our technology infrastructure, what possible insights we could derive from taking in all of this new data. We're having to learn new analysis techniques. But it also represents a huge opportunity, especially for hospitality, travel, and tourism. We're sitting on a gold mine of information from our consumers that will help us to deliver our services and products better. And so I'm really excited about the future of big data, but I think the challenge that we'll have to face is really exactly what we've been talking about all day, which is understanding what this thing is and unlocking its potential. Because every time you turn around with big data, you've got privacy concerns. You've got this, I always tell my customers, it's that fine line between crafty and creepy, right? So do you really want to let your customer know exactly how much you know about them and what they've been up to? So a lot of work, I think, the onus is going to be on the operators and the providers in this space to say, let's take advantage of this opportunity, be creative with it, and unlock all of this insight in this sort of very challenging environment. That's my...
And I'd like to change the terms of reference now to make it a little bit more interesting. So what Kelly said, because instead of each one of you repeating the same thing that she just said, kind of becomes a little bit of a problem. First, I'd like to ask the question, do you actually believe what she just said?
I do believe what she has said.
It comes from a different perspective, right? So, do you believe that it's actually new? Because I think that if I heard this, when Enter started 30 years ago, we would have said exactly the same thing that you said, Kelly. So, is it really new? Is this thing called big data, is it new, or is it just something that now, because of cloud computing and because we can make a lot of money off of it, it sounds cool, but it's the same thing rehashed again. David, what do you think about that?
I do think it is fundamentally different from 15 years ago or however many years ago, because the hospitality industry has got some of the most heterogeneous systems I've ever seen. So little connectivity among them, so that even if you had that amount of data, there's almost no ability to actually do anything useful with it. So much of this data has been siloed and completely unavailable to do any type of analytics to really leverage this stuff. So I'd say now, because of cloud computing in particular and the mobility, you're getting so much more data that it's so much faster to access now and really using your operations, but it's really the beginning of the beginnings, in my view.
And JP, what do you think?
So, should I do a brief introduction first, or just
Yeah,
jump in?
No.
All right. So, hi everyone. My name is JP Onnela. I'm actually a physicist by training, but I now work I'm faculty in the Department of Biostatistics at Harvard, and my group does two types of things. The first thing we do is, my background is in network science, which is the physics of complex networks. So we're looking at social and biological networks. We mainly focus on developing the mathematical tools, computational tools and algorithms. We also do some applied work in this area. The second area that my group does is we're trying to develop essentially data analytical techniques that might be especially well suited to analyzing the kinds of data that mobile phones and smartphones can produce. So these are the two streams of research that we do. Having done this introduction, I completely forgot the question, but let me weigh in a general way, if I may. So I think that a lot of the excitement around big data is warranted, but I think there's also a lot of excitement that's not. So I tend to be quite skeptical of some of the, and I just want to be somewhat provocative in my comments. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of some of the views that people occasionally raise. And I think that the main underlying, perhaps the fundamental point is that we don't really ultimately care, in my opinion, about having more data. I think what we really care about is making better inferences about the phenomena that we're studying. And more data often implies better inference, but it doesn't do that always. And I think it's important to keep this idea in mind. So if we think about if we think about some basic statistical problems, like for example surveying, we can pretty easily find out what percentage of the population is in favor of the Barack Obama, to give you a US-centered example. We don't need a huge sample for that. If we ask 1,000 people, we're actually fine. We understand that problem pretty well. So I think the volume, as was alluded to by the other two panelists, I think the volume aspect is the least interesting and exciting to me personally of the whole big data revolution. Because volume just means a bigger sample, but sampling is not the main problem. If we think about something like bias, for example, or to what extent the universe of Facebook users or Twitter users might represent the underlying population, I think these are much bigger questions.
So tell me, we work with the tourism industry, and Kelly, as you say, we've always been an information-intensive industry, right? Airlines, hotels, money. But it seems now that actually, and you mentioned this morning, and I've seen a number of others, it's really the sensor data that's really empowering the world, right? And the growth of most of this big data. What's relevant for us in the tourism industry? It's cool. In fact, I work with the health people at the University of Florida. It's a huge, incredible growth, right? But what does it mean for us in tourism? Well, who cares? It's cool. Sounds fun, but who cares? What do you think? 2 minutes.
I care a lot.
That's
your stuff. But
why should these guys care?
Jukka made a really good point. It's all in what you're going to do with the data and what makes sense to do. And so, given that there's so much of it out there, and that you have access to it, honing in on those key data points that are going to be the most meaningful in tourism is really going to be the trick. And it's good, and what's most meaningful for your business. So it is all about still asking the right question or starting with the business problem that you have. So if you are trying to drive traffic to your destination, what pieces of information do you have available to you now that you may not have had 10 or 15 years ago? Or that may have existed, but you didn't have the technology infrastructure to take them in and analyze them. So maybe it is some of the stuff we talked about this morning with using mobile devices to figure out who's coming through your area, some demographic profiles, and that may solve this business problem that you have. But the key with successfully unlocking the value of big data is always going to be about starting with the problem that you have first, and then looking at all of the new sources of data that potentially support a deeper insight to that problem.
So to follow up, the notion of science is always started, and you did your example of contract measurement. Now with big data, if I was a biostatistician, I'd say, that's interesting, but that's the 1940s, the 1950s. There's a new world in terms of science and how we acquire it.
Could you please use the microphone?
So to rephrase, that was ad-libbing, so I can't really re-say it. But essentially this new science, if you will, of big data, David, what do you think of that? And do you agree with her or disagree or what?
Yeah, I think she's spot on this. You have to determine what your problem is, and then how are you going to go about solving this problem. And I look at the hospitality industry as really, first and foremost, working to provide better guest satisfaction. If you talk to any of the GMs, whether here in the room or elsewhere, guest satisfaction is one of the most important KPIs, and I think as travelers, you want to be satisfied. And if there are ways to take this data and learn more about how to do that in a more consistent way, that's huge. Quality control in the hospitality industry, I think, is decades behind, say, manufacturing industries. It's all high latency, very random, and way after the fact. And putting real process control, you've got a lot more opportunity to do this. And big data is key to running, great process control.
And the driver of that is sensors.
It's a combination. It's sensors. It's looking at people's reviews. It's capturing feedback as soon as you can. During this experience, preventing additional problems, recovering your guests. And how do you drive loyalty? You need these insights.
And JP, how do you respond to that?
So I agree with a lot that was said by the other panelists. I think that always starting with problem is by far the most important thing. This is what I always stress and probably always overstress to my students. I think it's much more interesting and important to ask a very good question and give an even approximate answer to that very good question, rather than trying to answer a question that's somewhat interesting in the best possible way. Because in the first case scenario, even if you cannot solve the question perfectly, at least you've identified a good problem, and then somebody else might be, probably a smart student, might be able to work on that problem more. In the second case, you solved a perfect problem. I mean, you served a less interesting problem in a perfect way, but nobody really cares about that. So I think that what's happening a little bit is that we're all a little bit like kids in the candy store. There's so much data, it's somewhat overwhelming. But I think we need to come back a little bit from that. It's good to be excited, and I'm excited. And for full disclosure, I'm planning our data science program, so I have to be excited about this stuff. But I think we need to be asking those scientific or business questions first. I'm a scientist, that's why I think of scientific questions. If I were an entrepreneur, a business person, I would be asking relevant business questions first.
Okay, so to finish up, the last question is future, let's say the near future rather than the Watson kind of crazy future. David, what do you think?
Well, I think we're really, at the beginning of the beginning, from my perspective, on this. I mean, if you just look at, how recent, widespread reviews are, I mean, we're going to be getting so more. You look at the millennials; they share so much more than their parents, as an example. So you're going to see more and more information coming from there. You're finally seeing changes with widespread migration to cloud-based systems within the hospitality industry, and so you're going to have an ability to do a lot more of this in terms of analytics and really empowering people as a result. So I think it's an extremely exciting time across the spectrum. Whether it's grabbing information on guest profiles, tracking behavior, real-time stuff that's happening in the hotel. It's a great time.
JP?
So, since I'm not a tourism expert, let me reflect my thinking on this aspect a little bit more broadly. So I'm very excited, perhaps most excited specifically about sensor data. So if we think about some of the biomedical sciences more broadly, the past 10, 15, 20 years have seen enormous developments on the genetic side. We talk about genome sequences and deep genotyping and so on. So we understand these genetic factors pretty well. But what we don't understand nearly as well is the human phenotype, the behaviors, the things we do. I'm not talking about how tall I am, or how much I weigh and stuff like this. I'm thinking about things like, how many steps do I walk a day? We're actually developing right now some tools that enable us to study neurological disorders. So just to give you 2 examples on that. For example, we're collecting vocal samples from behavior, from individuals, and we're trying to learn if we could find some kind of behavioral markers for things like depression and so on. This is something that we couldn't do before. That's very exciting. We're also using GPS tracking, accelerometer, all of these kinds of things to learn about the behavioral patterns of individuals. Again, we've been able to ask in the past very generic questions like, how much did you move around the last 2 weeks? Not too much, intermediate amount, or a lot. Now we can ask much more specific questions. So the way I like to think about this, and again, this is just in the broader context, imagine if you had to go to see your PCP, your primary care physician, but they didn't have the basic things to quantify things about your health and both only health. So let's think about things like having a scale to be able to weigh you, or let's think about having a thermometer to be able to take your body temperature. We take all of these things for granted for now, but I think in a lot of areas we just don't have these basic things that we could use. So I see tremendous potential for psychiatric disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, and these types of things.
And can I just, a quick follow-up? Do you think that the health, in terms of sensorizing the world, is really pushing, and it's leading, we'll say, the industries in terms of understanding? Is health really, because it seems to me health is really sensorizing the world, much more than most other sectors.
So it's hard to make so I would have to know about all the other fields a lot. I'd have to be in all the other fields to really make a fair statement. I tend to think that health is actually somewhat conservative, and there are reasons for that, which is that it's about health. And for most of us, ultimately health is what matters the most, if push comes to shove. So I think that people are actually not making particularly good use or great use of sensors. But I think this is changing as we move on to what I think of as deep phenotyping.
Okay, great, thanks. And then finally, Kelly, your last word.
Manufacturing is also a good place to look in terms of being very forward-looking with sensor data because they're dealing with things and not people, so you don't have those same privacy issues. So I think they're heading into, and I totally agree. I think sensoring will be very interesting for hospitality and tourism. We will also run into these issues of privacy and crossing the line to creepy. But the other area that I think is going to be really interesting in terms of the future is video, and our ability to use video in our sort of operational analysis. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is cool. So we work with a major retailer, SAS, and they had this issue with what I would call like lumpy, demand. So all of a sudden, a big huge line opens up at the register, or big huge line forms at the register, and sometimes there's no line. So to save labor costs, they'll deploy the cashiers out on the floor for stocking tasks, right? And then when the line forms, they would have to call the cashiers back to the cash registers, which meant changing their clothes, changing their uniform back, finishing the stocking task, opening the drawer. So what they did was, so here's a basic problem, which is how do I balance my labor costs with service expectations? I mean, this is typical problem that retail and hospitality has all the time. But what they did was use the security video that they were already capturing in the stores. This is their data that already exists, to track traffic patterns through the aisles. And by understanding these traffic patterns, they could predict at what point that traffic would hit the register and proactively call in the staff so that they would be there when the demand hit the registers. So to me, the future is going to be these non-traditional data sources like video. Non-traditional data sources we may already be collecting for some other purpose that will start to open up these possibilities for hospitality and travel and tourism.
Okay, great, thanks. So this is, as a seed, we have a half an hour for questions and answers, replies to this incredible panel.
Or we could keep talking. Word.
Thank you very much for the great inputs that you provided to us. My question is more or less in the hospitality and tourism, even though there's big presence of big data, hotels collect a lot of information through loyalty or stays and such a thing, airlines as well. But I had a lecture recently and the professor brought some interesting point in the fact that even though there's so much data available, sometimes the companies somewhat get lost and don't really target properly, or they don't really know how to handle this. What would be perhaps an advice? What would be the reason why companies are still somewhat lagging behind other industries? Is it because they don't have, it's like a small to medium companies usually don't have the resources to make sense of this data?
Dave, do you want to?
Yeah, there are a lot of hotels, even though they're part of large chains, actually keep most of the guest data at their local hotels. So it's not being shared, and then you've got all these heterogeneous systems even within chains. And so I would say a lot of them are way behind the curve in terms of that. And it's just these historical decisions that were made. This hotel's using this system, this one's using another system, and I think a lot of that's a function of the ownership structure, which often is local. These are large hotel companies, but they don't own the properties, and they often aren't the ones that built them out. So you've got challenges like that, that blow your mind.
Yeah, I think you talked about this earlier, or alluded to at the beginning when you said, what my definition of big data sounds exactly like what we were talking about this from 20 years ago, which is true. The only reason why big data has become such a big deal is because the technology to manage the big data finally exists and is accessible. But it requires investment, and you have to modernize your existing infrastructure to take advantage of this big data. And so companies are having to find the justification to be able to And just like any other business, you have to prove the ROI before you make the investment. And added on top of that, all these complications that David mentioned, it just makes it really difficult for hospitality companies in particular to sort of wrap their arms around what to do about all this big data.
JP, do you want to follow up, or?
Sure. I think one thing I'd like to add that I think it's an interesting question. I think that probably has a lot to do with two things. You need hardware, machines, and you need people, human skills, knowledge. And to be able to analyze these kinds of data sets, and I'm biased because my mortgage is being paid by an educational institution, but it's a special set of skills that are needed. And I think a lot of data science type of programs are popping up now, and I think that's for a reason. I think people are realizing that a lot of areas, I think more than people envisioned initially, that actually where you need these types of skills.
Okay.
Ultimately, I guess money.
Yeah.
That's the ROI.
No, but you can't set aside the people issue here. And as an industry, if you look at all the studies, there's going to be this huge shortage of analytics and data science talent coming around in the next 5 to 10 years. So for those of you who are still students, and you want a big, high-paying job in a couple of years, data science. And then come talk to me.
She has the money, I think.
I have the software.
Yeah, this was also my topic. What's about the people behind? Because I think when I'm in the university, more in the tourism field, and I think what we are missing is the knowledge, the understanding, and the skills. Just what you said before, and maybe it is not only the data science, because the data science people, they don't have any idea about tourism, but there has to be something like a new kind of education between tourism, or let's say tourism skills and tourism understanding, and also the data science. Is there something around? Is that your topic? I don't know exactly.
He's jumping out of the seat already.
So just to chime in on that, I think that's a great point, and I think that data science is a new. I think it's like big data. Nobody really knows what that means. I don't think anybody really knows what data science means, but we know some things. So, for example, we do know that data science is not just traditional statistics. Statistics has a huge role in data science, just like computer science has a huge role in data science. But these two things are not the same. So I think that my understanding is that data science is usually considered to be more interdisciplinary. So you're bringing different types of skills, and the kinds of skills that would be especially relevant for an actual applied context. So you don't necessarily want to bring in a mathematical statistician, although you could, but maybe you get more out of your money if you bring somebody who has a more broader training.
So we, to your point, I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's going to be a partnership between companies like SAS, between the academic institutions and the industry to sort of drive this. And I know, so our founder, Dr. Goodnight, is really committed to education, both K through 12 and university. And so one of his passions is helping universities to build a master's in analytics, master's in data science, curriculums that are based on this emerging field, and to really provide opportunities for the students to learn so that they become marketable afterwards. But JP's point is very well taken. The challenge in this area is going to be somebody who is equally as able, both in the language of the business and also the language of the science. And that's a very unique person, but it does allow someone who has some passion to sort of apply it. But I think we'll see more of these partnerships. And this is no offense to anyone in the room at all, because I have my feet in both camps, but a lot of the challenge too is that academic institutions are not like super fast moving all the time. So to get one of these programs started, it takes investment and effort, and you got to get faculty convinced that they want to bring this into the classroom and change their curriculum. And so I think partnership between industry sort of pushing and providing funding and providing curriculum, and the institutions themselves wanting to embrace this is where we're going to end up. And I'm excited to see that happen over the next few years, but it's necessary.
So, and David, where do you see like the limitations and the challenges for hospitality to be able to actually use all this kind of technology?
Well, I think there are few. I mean, the people is definitely one of them because there aren't a lot of data scientists in the hospitality industry. And the other thing you have to recognize as an industry, this is a hyper-fragmented industry. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hotels. You look at the airline industry as an example. I mean, it's hundreds of airlines. So you've got orders of magnitude, difference in complexity just in terms of getting behind these systems. So I think that's a big challenge. I think domain expertise paired with data science and scientists is really going to be very critical. And the domain expertise in terms of working with these data scientists and diagnosing, what does this mean? Then taking that and saying, what can we do with this? So diagnostics and then prescription. So I think those are key things. And then there's this continuing evolution or movement rather to cloud services. And I think you're going to see this from a boutique hotel all the way up to several thousand hotel chain, and that's going to help enormously because now you're going to have a platform where, and if the industry can get together and anonymize some of this data, then they can share along these conclusions.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, regarding innovation and technology and tracking, so being able to gather and collect big data, are you in any way planning or maybe already doing using the wearable tech?
I use it personally, then.
You as a company, or are you planning to use this particular tool to use a new kind of trending technology to go further, even further with your data collection?
So, JP,
This is especially related to health, of course.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So we have thought about that a little bit, but that's not something we're actually doing right now. So we've developed this app, and the idea is that we want to think about a lot of the medical conditions we're interested in. These are very long-term medical conditions. This is not a week or a month. You're talking about a year or maybe 2 or 3 years. And you can think about degenerative disorders, psychiatric disorders, and things like this. So our approach has been to have a very light touch, very light instrumentation, because instead of trying to collect enormous amounts of data in 2 or 3 or 4 data points in time, we would actually like to measure behavior continuously. So from our perspective, it makes more sense to collect small nuggets of data every day or every hour, as opposed to having people wear all these gadgets. I'm sure that that's a natural extension, and these things are not mutually exclusive. So you could, for example, imagine in the health context, where a setting where you have a complementary instrumentation, which is added on top of the cell phone or smartphone instrumentation. So you could have patients wear these things for a couple of weeks and so on. But right now, it would be hard to see people wearing these things 24/7, like for a year. I wouldn't do that myself, so I guess it would be unfair to ask others to do that. But so my answer would be, we prefer ourselves in my group, we prefer to go with very light instrumentation because we need to have long-term follow-up. And occasionally maybe complement that with even richer data collection instruments and sensors. Great question.
Other responses or, no? Okay, let's go. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Jim.
David, you were spot on when you said that companies are interested in the customer service experience, and big data was going to help them better manage, particularly in real time. And I just had a phenomenal experience with British Airlines, where, from my perspective, they can't handle small data. So I booked the flight, and there's an hour 10 to connect at London Heathrow, between arriving from Miami and going to Milan. I say to the person selling me the ticket, that seems awful tight. The person says, no, the computer says it's fine. I get off the flight, and I've got an hour and 10 minutes before the plane takes off, and I don't even get to the gate by the time the plane has taken off. The luggage is now missing. I've got to go rebook the tickets. There's no one when I get off the flight to say, hey, it's going to be a bit tight. So I'm a bit skeptical about what big data is going to do when, for me, it's not rocket science to say, hey, And I told a couple of people, and they kind of laughed. Heathrow, an hour and 10 minutes? You got to be kidding. I mean, why is it that BA, with all of their medium-sized data, or whatever you want to call it, can't do the basic thing of, hey, the connection time's wrong? Or, knowing that the connection time is wrong, take care of me. Anybody, please.
I'm not going to speak for British Airways. That my brother works in the airline industry, works for United, and I've had that same complaint to him about airline stuff, and of course the issues around the operational efficiencies associated with connection times we could go into forever. But your point is well taken. This is why all three of us, I think, kept coming back to this this issue of define the business problem, understand what you're going to do with the data, know the so what. Because if we can't get the core service proposition correct, then we have no business monkeying around with a lot of ancillary stuff. And I've talked to some really smart hoteliers. I don't know if any of you know or have heard Ted Tang from Leading Hotels in the World speak, but he said at a conference one time, he's like, I love all this talk about big data. Big data is really exciting. I can't even get to small data. Could you just give me some small data? Like, I've got to start somewhere, right? And so, directly to your point, so I think, the smart operators are really going to be the ones that say, I'm going to use this responsibly. I know the so what. I know the business problem I'm trying to solve, and not go flinging around exploring with the new and shiny before they get the basics right.
What do you think?
Yeah, and I agree. I think that airlines are a pretty good example of a company that are not really making use of these types of data. They have lots of that data, but they've had even more basic problems, I think, for a long time. And I just want to briefly mention this and then move on. For example, the boarding experience could be made a lot more efficient in a number of different ways. This is something that has been studied. In fact, it's just the guy happens to be a physicist, but this has been studied by a physicist, and it's been demonstrated that you can actually cut out maybe half of the boarding time. So I think if there is no real desire to change the customer experience, I don't think all the data in the world is going to mean anything. But right now it sounds like, especially from your terrible experience, that this, I don't know about this particular company, but it sounds like they're not really making good use of their data.
I'd just like to add a couple of things to that. One is, I think a lot of the big data in hospitality is really driven on the buy side, on the marketing side. Because that's where you've got these huge online travel agencies as well as the brands. And there's a lot less big data in the operational side because tons of stuff is simply not collected. So I think the brand guys are going to be doing a lot of this stuff. Whether it's going to result in great guest satisfaction, that's questionable, I think, until you really deliver on the operations side.
Over on, yes, sir.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Bruce Martin from Judy Juice in London. So first of all, can I apologise about British Airways? I feel pretty bad about it, so I'll talk to them when we get back. So,
You guys to connect that to it.
Sorry, my question is a social media related question. One of the big trends in the last few years is the ability of everyone in the room to be able to log in and register on websites through your Facebook login, your Twitter, your Google+. And I guess a lot of us use that because it's really easy and it's quick. But that's given a lot of data and personal information to the ones that own the app and the website. So, question to the panel is, do you have any good examples of companies who are leveraging that social data really effectively to help their business?
So, there's a couple, the best examples that I have of companies that are leveraging social data are probably more on the review side, like I talked about this morning. So, understanding the voice of the customer, applying that across both marketing, but really the smart ones, David, to your point, are saying, well, what's the impact on operations and other functions within the hotel. The hospitality industry has a huge desire to do this kind of cross-channel marketing, data collection, be where the customer is, personalized web experience right now. A lot of them are driving towards it, but no one's really quite there yet. I think to the extent that retail and some of these other customers are.
So I think I would echo what Kelly has said on that point.
Okay, and
I think everything has to be said on this point, on this topic.
Okay. Next question. Sir.
Actually, I would like to continue on the same subject. The hotel industry's pricing strategy, or let's say pricing pollution on the web is totally terrible. I'm from Boğaziçi University, Istanbul, but I'm directing a travel portal project for an airline company, and they would like to pack up the hotels and make hotel and air packages and sell to the client directly on the website. But the problem we are facing is actually the big data, because we need to bring, online travel agencies, the hotels are on one side, it's like Expedia or Booking.com, but we need to get XML connections from 35 different hotel banks. Hotel banks are where hotels enter their data and prices differently. And around 25 different channel managers, and the same hotel has prices on all these channels. And bringing up all this information into one pot and then trying to find the best rate out of all this is really terrible. And maybe Mr. Topolewski might have an idea about which, what kind of way to follow on it.
Well, it's even worse when you go down to the hotel level, because most of these guys are manually allocating this inventory over all these, and it could be dozens of different OTAs, and somebody may sell out of that one. They don't have clear visibility on the pricing. Meanwhile, there's other inventory that is being unsold. So just, that by itself is a massive nightmare that needs to be fixed. You've just got this crazy proliferation here.
But let's be fair, that's the problem of the distribution channels, not the hotels. So the price pollution is all on the distribution side, right? Not all because of the point you're making, but the distribution landscape has really complicated this problem. And people doing exactly what it is that you're trying to do is making it even worse, right? So picking up rates from some other channel and reselling them somewhere else. So we're getting caught in our own trap with a lot of this stuff.
But we have our own airline company, so.
What's that?
We are the airline company, we're not a distribution channel.
Right, but I'm
Because
saying you're trying to pick up rates off of, so you're reselling a distribution channel rate from somewhere else, then you're, right?
Yeah, trying to get the best rate.
I know. That's, and look, it's all done with good intentions to try to get, to try to find the best rate possible from a consumer perspective. But you're right, it's a real mess.
But I think as the hotel industry has got to somehow push back instead of being commoditized by such a massive focus on price, which is what all the OTAs are doing. So I think it's something you got to think about.
That's a whole other panel, by the way.
Another question? Over and then
When thinking about the future of big data, what do you consider as the best source of big data for tourism industry in the few years to come? What is the source of data that tourism companies should really look into?
Well, I think it depends on what your problem is. I think a marketer is going to have one set of issues and data that's going to be most appropriate for them. I think some of the operations people in the hospitality industry are going to look at it differently, and there may be regional areas, whether it's a country or a particular region which is trying to attract a particular clientele. And I'll just give you one's a very simple example. The Chinese are now the world's largest overseas traveler by far, and they're growing very, very fast. So how do you attract that particular group of people, particularly given the language challenges? So where you get your source of data from really is dependent on how you've defined your problem.
okay. So,
It's me again. I just want to ask maybe one simple, question. Is there such a thing as too much big data, or do you see in the future companies being so overwhelmed? I know there's the shortage of skilled people to actually interpret that, but do you think in the future will be a point where companies will have so much and it will be like, okay, this not really that meaningful anymore, or something like that in the future, like too much data?
Well, I think we have it now. I mean, this is, and I don't know if you both would agree with me or not, but one of the real challenges with big data, well, Jake, you said it right at the beginning. If you torch your data long enough, it's going to give you the answer you want, right? And this is the problem with the more data there is, if you're not doing a directed analysis or really asking exactly the right question, then you will get distracted by the next shiny data object, or you will make the data answer the question the way you want. So yeah, I think there's always this danger of too much data, so we really do need to be disciplined. Just because we can store it, capture it, and analyze it now because we have the technology doesn't mean we should be. So it's a well-taken point.
And David, would you?
Yeah, I would just add that well, I'm probably saying the same thing, but just make sure that data has relevance to the problems you're trying to solve.
At least I think I was saying, thinking about this question as a scientist. I think science questions adapt as we learn more. So initially, when we have our early instruments, like Galileo was the first one to use a telescope to look at the stars, as opposed to look at parades and things like this, we have a lot of low-hanging fruits. But then it's a cumulative process, so knowledge accumulates. And the questions that we can ask become more refined, more complex, more subtle. So I don't think in the scientific context we ever will have enough data. It's just going to be harder to make more sense of those data. But this may be different than in a company context, tourism context, because there may be a point where you decide, well, actually, we're willing to go this far to give our customer a great experience, but maybe we don't need to go further given how much money is involved and so on. In the scientific context, that's probably not the case because we're thinking of some of the difficult diseases. I think we want to go as far as we possibly can because the hurdles that we have are so enormous.
So can I come back and follow that? Because I think it's a fantastic question. And to be honest, I disagree with both of you. I morally agree with you, but even push it further. I think that today is the same way. My PhD was 35 years ago in the beginning of the quantitative revolution in geography. And everyone was saying exactly the same thing about, they were learning about regression analysis or some really basic tools. You know what I mean? Oh, this is too much. Oh, we shouldn't be doing that. But now, of course, we've grown way past that. And I think that we're right now exactly at the same stage where we say, answer this question, is there too much data? And the answer is, we're asking the wrong questions. We're asking the wrong things. We don't have the tools to be able to answer the questions that we want to be able to answer because we really don't understand the world that we're operating in. And we keep on running into what what happens to us within the world or the distribution channels. And those are the things that really move us forward in terms of the future that we'll say Juan talked about with IBM. What do you think about that?
I mean, I agree. I think we're.
I mean, this is a.
Well, I would say that there are probably declining marginal returns to big data. So you've got it's probably some step function. At different junctures, things happen, then it becomes a lot less valuable to you when you've standardized this. But I think there are big implications for I think from an operations perspective when like there's always this trade-off with consistency and standardization and personalization. And personalization doesn't come for free generally. I mean, there's some places where you can do that quite well, but others it's a lot harder. So I think there's a balance to it. I think people should continue to push, but see where a particular data set starts dropping off in terms of its usefulness, and look elsewhere.
And
I think we also have this issue of thinking about it from sort of the perspective of a company that's trying to run a business versus scientific inquiry. And so we need to keep our minds open to innovation, but it also is very easy to get distracted within that. And that may be scientific discovery comes from sort of exploring and playing around. Could be that that same level of exploration will lead a company on a wild goose chase and end up not meeting their obligations to shareholders and stakeholders.
I think that's a great point. I think that there's no reason to assume that the optimal strategy would be referred to the fact that it may not be a great word, but a useful approach may not be the same for a scientific research question as it is for trying to run a company, and because you're doing two very different things. In one case, you're providing service to people. In another case, you're trying to learn more about the nature and framing this in the biggest possible terms. So why should it be that the most helpful, the most useful strategy should be the same? That's probably not the case. And David,